water panel, come on up. David Sutherland, Alicia Sharma, and Margaret Miner. David from the Nature Conservancy will give a big picture on the importance of water planning and allocation. Alicia will describe what's supposed to happen, needs to happen, to get the plan approved, and explain the complex issue of registration diversion. And Margaret will raise a really important issue that's just come back on the radar. Is water a public trust or not? Panelists will introduce themselves, and they will model tightness in 7 minutes each.
That's right.
Is Margaret in the room?
Margaret's on her way.
Margaret,
I will defy the other panels to duplicate our carefully choreographed entree onto the stage. Wow.
Yeah,
Done with military-like precision.
Just a little bit of advocacy on the way.
Well, good morning. In most years, in a typical year, Connecticut's very fortunate in that we usually have ample rainfall and precipitation, and compared to many parts of the year, our precipitation is pretty evenly distributed throughout the year. But even in some of these typical years, to say nothing of some of our drier years, we've still got parts of our state, we've still got communities where there is deep concern that we don't have enough water right now for human needs, or we don't have enough for the projected increases in human need for water. And we've still got streams where there's insufficient water to support healthy fish populations and other aquatic organisms. We've had some notorious cases, fortunately not too many of those, but we've had some cases where streams have literally been sucked dry, completely dry, with significant fish kills. But I think it's really important to stress that you don't have to completely dry up a stream in order to create conditions that are going to be unsustainable for aquatic life. Certainly, you might drive over the stream on your way to work every morning in your neighborhood, drive over the bridge, and everything looks beautiful. There's sunlight reflecting off the water in the stream, the trees are beautiful. But if the water levels are significantly and consistently lower than we'd get in natural conditions, fish in many cases are not going to be able to survive, or they're not going to be able to reproduce. So you won't see a lot of dead fish around. They just won't be reproducing over a period of years. In some cases, natural drought conditions, natural meteorological trends or occurrences can create these stressful conditions. But all too often, these stressful conditions are created by our use of water that's either poorly informed in terms of the knowledge we need to know about stream levels, or there's been poor planning done, or the planning and knowledge have been ignored, or the regulations that are supposed to govern our use of water have been inadequate. So for many years, river advocates and a lot of other interested parties have been pushing for comprehensive planning around our use of water, our use of land as it affects our water supplies, and around water conservation, so that we can determine the best and the fairest ways of allocating the water in our streams. So, and also the water underneath the ground in our aquifers, so that all parts of the state have adequate water for our uses and for fish and other aquatic organisms. This type of planning, to do it properly, involves a lot of aspects that get very complicated very quickly, whether we're thinking about a better scientific understanding of the quantities and levels of water we need in different types of streams at different times of the year to support different aquatic species. It gets very complicated when we think of the laws governing water, our use of water, and the history of those laws, which in some cases stretches back centuries in common law. The technology and the mechanics of how we manage water, filter it, distribute it are very complicated. What are the best techniques for irrigating agricultural areas for different types of crops? And then what are the financial aspects? How do we value water? How do we price it? How do we charge ourselves, in effect, for the water that we need? How do we fairly compensate the water companies? And they range from very large to very tiny, privately owned, investor-owned, municipal, regional. How do all of those different types of water companies get fairly compensated for the infrastructure that they're building and maintaining and operating? And then there's the simple aspects of it, like the politics. So, so speaking of the politics, as you'll see in the notes here in the folder, in 2001, the legislature established the Water Planning Council, which is comprised of 4 agencies: DEEP, the Department of Public Health, the Office of Policy and Management, and the utility regulators, PURA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority. And the legislature charged that council with addressing issues, addressing issues regarding water companies, water resources, and state policies which affect future drinking water supplies. And they set up an advisory committee comprised of many stakeholders, and they also established 6 subcommittees to deal with those different aspects of water planning. And I think the results over the next decade or so ranged from the very productive and good analysis and discussion and reports to the, let's say, excruciatingly frustrating. So in 2014, the legislature revisited the issue and called on the past legislation which mandated that the Water Planning Council develop a comprehensive water plan that would balance a lot of these different aspects. And they gave them, importantly, they gave them several $100,000 to hire a consultant who has been working for the past 1.5 years with the steering committee for the water plan, the Water Planning Council Advisory Committee, to address all of these issues and develop a 630-page plan. Just earlier this week, the Water Planning Council voted to approve that plan for its submission to the legislature. And they'll be taking it up this session, and my colleagues here are going to talk about some of the issues that came up in a little more detail.
So before getting into the issues, I just want to give you all information about what happens next. Now, I think when we were sitting up here last year during the summit, there were a lot of us that wondered if this plan was going to be done for submission to the legislature, and I'm very pleased that the process has come to where it is now so that we have this plan to submit to the legislature this session. So what happens next is that this plan goes to, and I can't remember if it's 4 or 5 committees of cognizance within the legislature. There will hopefully be 1 public hearing for the state water plan and not 4 or 5 in each committee. We all have our fingers crossed for that. And each committee will either send the plan back to the Water Planning Council for revisions or approve it to send on to the General Assembly. Obviously, it's got to be approved by all of the committees of cognizance in order for the General Assembly, or in order for it to go to the General Assembly. So if the revisions could take longer if they require, a little bit more thought and stakeholder input. That water plan can come back this session, but it could come back the next session to those 4 committees of cognizance again. Again, it has to be approved by the entire General Assembly in order for this plan to be ready for implementation. So within 24 months of submission to the legislature, if this plan is not approved by the entire General Assembly, it goes to the governor to say yes or no. What happens if he says no is not clear right now. But one of the important things to note here, and I think a lot of you have already seen the draft plan that was out for public comments, are familiar with what the plan has done well and what still lacks. This process is not done once the General Assembly approves the plan. There is still a lot of work. Some of the very hard issues were not brought about to full stakeholder consensus. One of those big issues is registered diversions. Well, the plan does have a good pathway forward for obsolete and unused registered diversions. We didn't have time to really solve the hard issue of the problems that registered diversions cause. And this must be addressed in order for us to have a truly good and consistent decision-making process. Now, I've heard during some public comments during Water Planning Council meetings, there are some entities that say, we're really tired of seeing, you know, a certain kind of bill coming to the legislature every session about water. Well, these kind of bills come to the legislature because we have a system, we don't have a public process in every instance in how our water is managed. So the only pathway forward for the public, for users of users of water for public health, for users of water for recreation, is to go through the legislative process. And if we can solve the problem, and I guess I should back up and explain what a registered diversion is. I'm assuming that all of you know. So when the Water Diversion Act was developed in the 80s, they had to do something about people that already had water rights. So what they did was they asked the people who already had water rights to register their diversion with the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And they pretty much have rights to that water, the entire amount that they had registered for in perpetuity. There was never an environmental review on this. So within a certain area, the entity that owns this water right can use water within that particular area. And sometimes that area is small, and sometimes it's fairly far-reaching to where if they want to transfer water from one area to another, such was the case with MDC and Yukon several years ago, people don't have an opportunity to have a say about where that water goes. And it was very apparent to people when that controversy was happening that just because they have it here and they want it here doesn't necessarily mean that it can automatically happen. There has to be a better decision-making process. So unless we really address the issue of registered diversions, we can't have that very good decision-making process.
Sure. So you understand it's going to go to the legislature, and there are actually a couple of legislators here. I would like to be sure they're held accountable, so perhaps they would. I saw Tony Wong. Tony, are you here? I saw Representative Steinberg. Are there others that we missed? Would you like to be oh, please.
Lori just said, let's be sure we acknowledge and welcome the legislators and have them all stand up.
Yeah. There we go. I guess I didn't circulate enough at the breakfast. There's some very important legislators here now that I look around, and we're relying on you. One of the water issues that has come up to the legislature, and they're hoping that the plan will address, is how do you manage water in a drought? We've had a couple of years of severe summer droughts, one fairly mild. We're in what they're calling now a stealth drought. So legislators, the state has been working on a new drought management plan since 2003, I believe, and they're close. but understandably, with droughts happening, there's a good deal of impatience. So one thing we're really looking for is that this plan will realistically address who does drought management, how it's handled, and who gets to decide. Legislators introduced quite a good bill last year, and they may do that again. Which will raise the question of what should be in the water plan, and are there aspects of the problems that we face that perhaps should be addressed in some other way. Ideally, drought management will be in the water plan. Drought management raises the question, as I'm sure many of you heard, who gets to allocate the water? Who decides? If there's a low flow and low reservoirs, and there's a new high-volume user that moves into the neighborhood, and obviously I see people nodding. They might be thinking of Niagara water bottling in Bloomfield, but the problem exists statewide. There are stress watersheds. There are high-volume users. The state often wants high-volume users. Who decides what the rules are for that and how the water gets allocated in a drought? That has led that question of whose water is it and how do you decide who gets it in times of stress has led directly to our latest, most interesting controversy. In the state water plan, there was a debate in the last few weeks whether it should be made apparent and stated as important that the principle that water is a public trust resource is the foundational principle in Connecticut for allocation and decision-making for a natural resource. This principle is embodied in our Connecticut Environmental Protection Act, but if you look at the wetlands law, it appears to be very firmly stated there. That doesn't mean it's easy to codify, to put into regulations, but it is a guiding principle. Most people think, but some people think that it's too complex or too ambiguous, and there has been, as you may have heard, advocacy to leave that concept for discussion later. The Water Planning Council has affirmed that principle, which is good news, but I think as we go forward, we want to keep that in mind. Saying that water isn't a public trust is a little bit like saying government isn't for the people. Okay, you don't have a whole lot of laws that say government is for the people, but it is something you kind of assume. And with the water, it's a very similar situation. The water is for the people, and it should be managed sustainably for current, who's here now, and who's coming up. So keep an eye on that. It's going to be a very interesting year.
Coming my way. I believe there has been a basket or bowl circulating to capture your questions. And does anyone know where that is?
But if not, I think everyone has a card in their packet. They have
Yep, okay. Okay, the well-oiled machine continues. While we're getting questions, would one person like to model asking a brief, genuine question? Lori.
I don't know if there was much said about usage, and I think part of the problem is getting there. Why we're here. I saw something on the news about other countries, for example, Cape Town, Africa, and the percentage of water that we use in the United States versus what they use in Africa. Africa uses 19 gallons. Oh, now they have to actually ration. We use 100 gallons average a day.
So is your question about how we can manage and reduce that?
Yeah, I think that should be part of the equation.
Great, thank you. Comment? It's important.
So there are some very good policy recommendations and other recommendations within the water plan for conservation, and not just conservation in drought. Water reuse, using the best water, using the appropriate water quality for the use. However, it needs to be stronger and more enforceable, in my opinion. When, you know, the peak usage is during the summertime when we have less rainfall. That peak usage is not for public health, it's for green lawns. And the strength in which the message goes out when we begin to go into drought is laughable at times. And for the amount of time that it often extends into drought, that lack of educating the public that they need to use less water and let the lawn go brown so we all have water to drink. Cape Town, in the middle of April, will have no water left. Cape Town will be providing 6.5 gallons of water a day to 3.7 million people at 20 distribution stations. And you know what? I bet 20 years ago, somebody said, that'll never happen. And this is the time where we need to start really putting very strong measures in place to educate the public on how they can use water more efficiently, because you can have nice landscaping if you do it correctly and use a lot less water, and reduce that peak demand during times when we don't get the rainfall.
Oh,
Great, thank you.
one cure that we have looked at for that is, as currently, for most water companies, their revenue depends upon how much water they sell. We had the very similar situation with energy. There needs to be decoupling. About 3 years ago, a law passed that it sets up a procedure for private water companies where they can have a sustainable revenue flow. I believe that process should be extended to the municipal and regional water suppliers as well. That provides an incentive, or at least a no penalty for doing conservation as a water supplier.
And I think when we think of water conservation, it's also really interesting or necessary to think about energy consumption, that even those of us who are on private wells and septic systems, where you can think, well, probably if I'm not using it for irrigation and it gets evaporated, that the water I'm using in my house is probably ending up in the same basin and all. It's probably okay. But every gallon of water I use, particularly every gallon of water that I heat, is consuming significant amounts of energy. So I think it's wiser use of water is both water conservation and energy conservation.
Great, okay. Once approved, can the water plan be amended, and if so, by what process? Quickly.
Well, the process is iterative, and that's the reason, something I did not point out when I said there's still work to do, that so in 5 years, there will be a second iteration of the water plan. So it will be changing, and we will be working toward a better plan through that iteration. That's why I said the work does not stop. So yes,
Okay,
there will
great.
be an opportunity for change.
Thank you. Water will be the oil of the 21st century. What do we do about industrialists who have vowed not to rest until every drop of water on Earth is privatized? Who wants it this?
Talk with your legislators, your elected officials, your congresspeople, and just keep talking about this.
I do want to point out that in Connecticut, we have private companies, public companies that are regional, which are quasi-public agencies, and municipal. Curiously, perhaps, the private companies are regulated through PURA with their rate structure. So they frequently have better management practices required of them in their rate structure applications that are not required of the private and regional companies who have to go back and raise taxes typically, or fees. So it's, the privatization, I think itself, in most parts of the world, is the real issue. Here, I think it's managing water, again, for the public benefit, not for the benefit either of someone who wants to get elected again or who has a very good salary for having some role in a public company.
This is why the public trust doctrine should be foundational.
Yeah, and there's a related question I'll just touch briefly. In the, in the next phase, and in the public trust framing, questioner wants to know, is there a way to establish priorities for uses? Maybe?
Prioritization seems to be a hot potato in the water planning process. Do you agree?
Okay.
I think when in the drought management, this is where we really have to look at what triggers exist for different users, and there need to be no changes for this. The Department of Public Health already has the power to say yes or no to a plan that a water utility presents on their drought triggers. Whether they exercise that or not, and the strength to which they exercise that, so that we all have access to water to public health,
Thank you.
is
Okay.
questionable.
Beautiful. And if I could just say, I remember like a decade ago, dealing with a water issue far from here, but talking to a local elected official, not in Connecticut, who said, my teenage kids take 25-minute showers. I'm powerless. I want to digest that, because I think what we saw a few years ago with the Niagara issue and the discovery of it and the engagement of citizens, and what we see when we're at our best, is we are not powerless, and we need a whole different dimension of leadership, I believe. So thank you, Water Panel.
Family therapy.
Okay.